are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
We're continuing our series on presidents with the fourth of 5 podcasts covering Theodore Roosevelt. Today we'll be discussing his life following his presidency. He honored his pledge not to run for more than one term, although, as you pointed out in our last podcast, he was not constitutionally prohibited from running. And so he supported William Howard Taft as his replacement, but he rapidly became disenchanted. Immediately following the election of Taft, Roosevelt disappeared to go hunting and touring Europe. And Tom, I think you found this particularly interesting.
I did, Richard. Part of it is because of my education. And I had a fabulous lecturer, professor for American history at the University of Texas named George Forgey. And I cannot emphasize how great he was, how much he influenced my study and my thinking on history. But he found this phase of Roosevelt's life almost laughable, indeed even beyond parody. And it always struck me and has stuck with me since that time about this big game hunting tour he did in Africa, where basically he said a blind Roosevelt would stand with his gun while a guide shot the animal. And in just the little research we did on this phase of his life, I found that not to be true. Now, he did kill or trap over 11,000 animals. We have to acknowledge that. But he did so for the Smithsonian, for the New York Museum of Science. He had scientists with him. He had anthropologists with him. He had botanists. He had a large number of people there to collect information. He also had, of course, guides and other big game hunters. But the second part of this expedition is what I really wanted to focus on, Richard. And in this second part, he journeys from Africa to embark on a tour of Europe. He started in Egypt and then from there jumped over to Europe, and he met with Franz Joseph, Kaiser Wilhelm, King George V. In Oslo, he delivered a speech calling for the limitation on naval armaments, certainly presaging treaties that were signed post-World War II. He argued for a permanent court of arbitration along the lines of his arbitration of the Russo-Japanese War of 2004-05. He argued for the creation of a League of Peace among world powers. He argued at Oxford, debated at Oxford, I should say. And this foreign trip, I think, really helped establish him as one of the great thought leaders that we would say now in American politics, but also with a much more forward outlook, much more foreign outlook. And Roosevelt, I think it informed many of his views going forward. And it goes back to a theme that we have talked about many times over this podcast series on Roosevelt, of a lifelong learner. And you were quick to point out absolutely correctly that it was not just book learning. It was studying. It was talking to others. It was doing investigations. It was going to sites on his own. You mentioned his in the Civil Service Commission when he had hearings in Milwaukee. Nobody has hearings in Milwaukee, and certainly not in the late 1890s. Sorry, Flan, for that slight on your hometown, or any of our other fans from Milwaukee. But nobody went to Milwaukee. But he did, and this is just one more example of a massive learning experience that Roosevelt engaged in, and when you couple that with the big game hunting expedition, whatever we may think of big game hunting now and how it's so far fallen from favor, that in many ways was a learning experience for him too. And it points out to me that consumption of information never ends if you choose not to. And it can make you a better leader, a better person, a better presidential candidate, or a better something.
I found his European tour quite interesting too. He was he attended the funeral of Edward VII, and that's when he met George V. But apparently his role there was an interesting one because he was not the ambassador to the court of St. James. He was simply happened to be there at the time. But all of these kings wanted to talk to him. I think that says a great deal about his charisma and just his general fascination to a lot of people, which probably part of that was his career as a cowboy and as a Rough Rider. But it was very interesting how happily received he was by the crowned heads of Europe.
So, Richard, then we move to, you mentioned this, the schism between himself and Taft and how that led to the 1912 convention and the Bull Moose Party. What did you see in that phase of his career?
Well, I think a lot of his disenchantment with Taft was related to Taft being a lawyer and a very careful lawyer. And, of course, he subsequently became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But during his term, there were a number of court decisions that basically stopped a lot of the progressive or overturned a lot of progressive policies. To Roosevelt, it was a contest between legalism and justice. And in this case, both Taft and Roosevelt's friend Elihu Root were really lawyers to the core. In fact, he once said Elihu Root was 7/8 lawyers and 1/8 man. The issue of the ability of people to vote to overturn judicial decisions was one that he brought up in the run-up to this election. And it's not one that I was aware of. As a recovering attorney myself, I find it appalling, leading to the tyranny of the majority and all that. But Roosevelt felt very strongly. And in the context of the time, battling the entrenched forces of conservatism, his rule may have made some sense. Both Robert La Follette, the progressive candidate, and Roosevelt opted to run against Taft, the incumbent president. Roosevelt also began to campaign in person, which was a break with tradition. And the campaign was vicious and personal. They insulted a lot of each other a lot. Some of the terms are really quite humorous. But ultimately, I find this a puzzling aspect of his personality. Root, who knew him quite well, believed that it was because his characteristic was that he was essentially a fighter. And when he gets into a fight, he becomes completely dominated by the desire to destroy his adversary. And I think once he viewed Taft as an adversary, he fell into that. One of the other things about this election that I thought was so fascinating was I had always thought that the use of primaries did not come up until the 70s. But in this election, several states used a primary system to nominate their delegates, and Roosevelt won most of them by a significant margin, which showed the divergence between popular enthusiasm for him and the enthusiasm of the party leaders to maintain their own positions. He broke a lot of friendships by his decision to contest the election, including both Root and Henry Cabot Lodge. The actual convention involves a lot of sort of inside baseball stuff, but eventually Taft was the nominee, and everyone knew at the time that he was a losing candidate. And the only way I can really explain that is that local and state politics matter too. For a lot of the delegates to the convention, loyalty to the party would supersede winning this particular election. Roosevelt was a very poor loser. I think rage and revenge were his motivations. And in fact, the night after Taft was elected, he spoke at a large meeting that basically founded the Bull Moose Party.
Rich, we had one of an incident in the campaign, and I think it bears mentioning, and whether this is luck, whether it's something else, it's the assassination attempt. And
well, you said earlier that nobody goes to Milwaukee, and perhaps there is. Roosevelt, I guess, showed his usual energy during this campaign. He crisscrossed the entire country making speeches. The platform of the Bull Moose Party, which is, I guess technically it's called the Progressive Party, but everyone called it the Bull Moose Party, was a bit of a compromise platform because one of Roosevelt's big financial backers was a man named Perkins, who was a former J.P. Morgan partner. And basically there was a contest between the economic elite who backed Roosevelt and some of the true believers, including Gifford Pinchot, who were the true progressives. Anyway, so Roosevelt goes to Milwaukee to make a speech, riding in an open car, and a man named John Schrank, who believed that the ghost of William McKinley had called on him to kill Roosevelt, shot him in the chest with a .38. The bullet went through his overcoat, his folded 50-page speech, spectacle case, suspenders, shirt, and undershirt, and it still cracked a rib. He insisted on making the speech. He refused to go to the hospital, talked for 80 minutes, and eventually went to the hospital. They decided not to remove the bullet, which after Garfield's experience was probably a good call. Schrank himself was found not guilty by reason of insanity and institutionalized until his death in 1943. But yeah, I think that was a fascinating little interlude in his life.
And that led to one of the great elections in U.S. history, that of 1912. And as you foreshadowed, Richard, it was a wipeout for the Republicans in the Bull Moose. Although Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, only held 42% of the popular vote, and I believe Roosevelt had 27% and Taft some 23%, the Electoral College swung in a landslide of 435 to Wilson, 87 or 88 to Roosevelt, or 83 to Roosevelt, and 8 to Taft. So a massive landslide. Republicans are wiped out in both houses of Congress. This leads to many of the some of the many progressive reforms that had literally been percolating for 20 years were enacted in the first term of Woodrow Wilson. But it's hard to really recreate the antipathy of Taft and Roosevelt towards each other. And we had Ross Perot, who I think largely led to the defeat of George Bush the elder after his first term, leading to the win of Bill Clinton. I'm not sure I saw the level of antipathy in that race that we saw in our research for the 1912 presidential election. But there were some important leadership lessons. Once again, leaders are learners. From the leadership blog, and then from Doris Kearns Goodwin, don't be afraid to make some unpopular decisions. And you're absolutely right. His decision to run was very unpopular with a certain coterie of the Republican Party, and literally destroyed the Republican Party for the next 8 years. But he made that decision. And then once again, when you get new information, you can make a change in your decision. So we saw that as well, once again, coming from the blog post Leadership Hacks. Any other leadership lessons that really struck you from this phase of Roosevelt's career?
Well, the one would be the importance of personality. Wilson was really a minority president in that he only got 41 or almost 42% of the popular vote. Eugene Debs got over 1 million votes for the Socialist Party.
While in prison.
But I guess the other thing that really struck me at this phase of his career is the danger of emotion driving you. I think once he got into this fight, he became blinded to the damage he was doing. He had basically devoted his life to the Republican Party, and then he bolted them simply out of personal antipathy for Taft, I think. And led to the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, which we'll be discussing in a subsequent podcast, but it was certainly not necessarily the greatest thing for the country. And then, of course, there's the issue of succession. It turned, he had stepped aside for Taft, but it turned out he, like many people, was unable to actually give up the limelight. And I think that's another important lesson for us all, that there is a time when you should probably step aside and leave. On that note, I guess our next podcast will be discussing his life post-Bull Moose, and we hope you'll join us at that time. For now, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox.
Presidential Leadership Lessons for the Business Executives was recently honored by the communicators with an award of distinction for podcast. We certainly are thrilled to have received that. Presidential Leadership Lessons for the Business Executive is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.